Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Theodore Roosevelt. For those of you who don't know me, I was the 26th president of these great United States, and I'm very happy to be here today, back in the West, back where I learned so much, made so many good friends. I owe a lot to the West, turned me into the man I am today, showed me the joy of living a strenuous life. And that's why I returned to the West to gather my Rough Riders for my regiment. You see, Congress authorized the raising of 3 cavalry regiments from the Western Territories for the Spanish-American War, and Secretary Alger, the Secretary of War at the time, he offered me command of one of the regiments, even though I didn't have any battlefield experience, because he knew how much I wanted to fight on freedom's battlefield. Well, fortunately, I was wise enough to tell the secretary that I believed I could learn to command the regiment in a month, but it was just that very month which we could not afford to spare with the war looming so near. So I told him that I would be delighted to go as lieutenant colonel if he would make my good friend Dr. Wood, a decorated Indian fighter, the colonel of our command, which he did. Now, the mustering places for the regiment were New Mexico and Arizona, Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, and our difficulty in organizing the regiments was not so much in the selection of the men, but in the rejection of them. We had 780 positions available, and for every position there were more than 10 men ready to go. Our limit was quickly raised to 1,000, so we were able to accept volunteers from anywhere in the country instead of just from the territories. We drew recruits from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, many other colleges, and 4 policemen who'd served under me when I was the police commissioner of New York City insisted on going. I had friends everywhere who wanted to be a Rough Rider. We had a war that everyone wanted to fight. Well, most of the men in the ranks were youngsters. Some of the college boys had had some challenging adventures in life, like sailing around the world or mining in Alaska, hunting in Africa. So they had the mettle to match the rugged men of the West. They were all soldiers, ready-made. But what was necessary was to teach them how to act together as a unit and to obey orders. I had to rescue more than one mountain man from the stockade for failing to salute or follow orders. They were just too independent and used to doing things their own way. But our most important task was to make the men ready for action in the shortest possible time. It was astonishing how disorganized we were at first, and what a difference 2 or 3 weeks of training made in the men. Now, while the officers and the men were learning their duties, getting to know each other, Colonel Wood, he tried to get some proper equipment for our troops, especially wanted to get smokeless gunpowder so we wouldn't be so easily spotted on the battlefield. And as the last rifles, revolvers, saddles arrived, we were ordered to proceed to Tampa, Florida. Everyone was so excited. We'd all enjoyed our training in San Antonio, home of the Alamo, but we were glad to leave those hot camps of Texas behind and start to gather to invade Cuba. We stayed in Tampa for 4 or 5 days, and then we were ordered to leave for a secret destination, and leave our horses and take only 8 troops of men, 72 a troop. And we were stunned by those orders, shocked in disbelief. Leave our horses behind? How could we do that? We trained as a cavalry, not an infantry. These were cowboys. Some of the men had never been without their horses, not even for a day. Leaving their horses behind would be like cutting their legs off. These animals were family. It was like breaking up a marriage for some. But the hardest task, by far, was to select the 4 troops that were to stay behind and not go to Cuba. After all the time and sacrifice and training the men had done, all the glory they had dreamed about, and now we had to choose who was to go and who was to stay behind. It was a bitter disappointment. I saw more than one grown man burst into tears when they found out they couldn't go. But those who stayed behind deserved just as much honor and glory as those who went. Every man was doing his duty, and following orders, and the hardest and most disagreeable duty of all was to stay behind. Credit should be given to the performance of duty, and not just what is very often the accident of glory. So 4 troops were chosen to stay behind, take care of the horses, and we had to leave a few of our mascots behind as well. Some of the men from Arizona had brought with them a mountain lion they named Josephine, and the men from New Mexico had brought with them a war eagle that they named Roosevelt in my honor. The problem was that Josephine hated Roosevelt and was constantly trying to make a meal of him, especially when we endeavored to take their photographs together. But we did take a scruffy little dog with us that we found on the docks, and we named Cuba. He was a smart little dog, great comfort to many of us during the campaign. Well, eventually our joy of leaving outweighed our sorrow, and we headed to our secret destination. When we arrived, we were given orders to board the Yucatan, which was a ship that was harbored out in the bay. So Colonel Wood, he seized the launch and rowed out and boarded her. Meanwhile, I overheard 2 of the other regiments given the same orders to board the Yucatan. So I ran back to our train, left a strong guard with our baggage, and double-timed the rest of the regiment to the dock just in time to board the ship as it came ashore and hold it against the other regiments who arrived just minutes later. Big argument followed, but since we had possession of the ship, the others finally had to retreat and find other means. And that's why we had to leave so many men and horses behind. There just were not enough ships to carry everyone to Cuba. And when we landed in Cuba at a small port town named Daiquiri, it was so primitive that it had no docks, so we had to throw the few horses that we had for the officers overboard and let them swim ashore. Then the men had to gather the weapons, whatever gear they could carry, and jump from the ships and swim and wade ashore as best they could, all in great confusion. It was not quite the heroic landing that we had envisioned. We stayed in Daiquiri for a few days, waiting for orders to advance, and finally, when they came, Colonel Wood set off at such a pace that many of the men had a hard time keeping up. They were all cowboys and were used to riding their horses, not walking. I mean, we had trained as a cavalry, not an infantry. Men got blisters, had trouble walking because of their bowed legs, and even though we complained about the forced march at the time, later we were very happy that we did it, because if we hadn't, we might have missed the war altogether. When we did reach the front, Colonel Brodie had just been hit by a bullet, shattered his arm, and he stood as long as he could, but eventually he became faint, so he had to be sent to the rear, whereupon Colonel Wood ordered me to take charge of the left wing in Brodie's place and bring it forward, which I did. And just like that, I became a colonel. The Rough Riders behaved very well indeed. Everyone fought bravely. There had been some question as to whether the volunteer troops, the colored troops, would be able to fight as well as the regulars, but I found no difference at all. Every man did his duty and fought with courage, honor, and intelligence. I was very proud of them all. On June 30th, we received orders to march against Santiago, and almost immediately the hills were covered by troops, the Rough Riders, the colored troops of the 9th and 10th, some of the men from the 1st, and there was the usual confusion, and afterwards there was much discussion about who occupied the hill first, for this was the famous San Juan Hill, which gained so much notoriety, publicity. The Spaniards, they held the high ground, which gave them a great advantage, so it was only by sheer determination that our men were able to make the assault. When one man would fall, another would take his place until we finally overcame the enemy. I rode my little horse Texas back and forth at the base of the hill, rallying the men, urging them on, and then I spurred little Texas straight up the hill, shouting to my men to follow me. I quickly outdistanced them because I was on horseback, and when I came to an obstacle I couldn't ride around, I jumped off my horse and drew my saber and continued my charge with my sword and my pistol in hand. It was a bully good charge, bully good, one of the greatest thrills of my life. And we reached the top of that hill and could see the Spaniards running from their rifle pits, and I stopped the men from shooting for fear that they might injure some of their own, and called on them to charge the next line of trenches to our right. Thinking that the men would follow me, I jumped over a fence and shouted, "Follow me!" But the troopers were so excited they didn't hear me or didn't heed me. After running about 100 yards, I found I only had 4 men following me. Bullets ripped through the grass around us, and one of the men was suddenly hit, mortally wounded, and there was no use in going on with just 3 men, so we went back to bring up the rest of the brigade. I ran back, jumped the fence, went over the crest of the hill, shouted at the troopers for not following me, and they, of course, were quite innocent of any wrongdoing, and even while I shouted at them, I shook my head at the look of injury and surprise on their faces while they cried out, "We didn't hear you, Colonel. We didn't see you go. Lead on. We'll surely follow." So I leapt over the fence again, and Major Jenkins joined me, as well as the rest of the men from the various regiments, and we were again under heavy fire and pushed the Spaniards from the trenches and ranch houses through a line of palm trees and over the crest of a chain of hills, and as we reached the last ridge, we found the city of Santiago shimmering below us. At 12 noon, we were notified to stop firing, and a flag of truce was sent in to demand the surrender of the city. Peace negotiations dragged on for about a week, and every day we expected either to see the city surrender or to charge on again. Finally, on the 10th of July, we did begin to fight again, but Spaniards did not have their heart in the fighting. So on the 17th, the city formally surrendered, and the American flag was hoisted, and trumpets blared, and men cheered, and we knew that our freedom fight was over. Cuba was free. On August 6th, we headed back home after waiting for more than 2 weeks to evacuate because Congress wouldn't order us home. We'd won the war, but we were left to suffer and die with fever and dysentery in the tropics. I sent letters every day trying to negotiate our return, and finally we were shipped to Montauk Point at the tip of Long Island, where we quarantined for another month before we disbanded. On the last Sunday before the regiment broke up, I supplemented Chaplain Brown's sermon to the men by a short sermon of my own. I told them how proud I was to be one of them, but I warned them not to think that they could now go back home and rest on their laurels. I bid them remember that for a month or 2, the whole world would be willing to treat them as heroes, but after that, they would have to get back to work like everyone else, not just sit around telling war stories. Those Rough Riders, they presented me with a fine bronze statue of Remington's the Bronco Buster, which was just the perfect gift. Afterward, they all filed past, and I shook hands with each and every one of them, said our goodbyes, invited them to come and visit if they ever got the chance, which many of them did when I was in the White House. He created quite a stir in Washington when they would charge in with their rough manners and frontier ways, but they were always welcome. I'd leave meetings with ambassadors and foreign dignitaries to welcome Rough Riders. We were a family, a team of freedom fighters. We were blood brothers, closer than any group of men that I have ever known. We were freedom fighters fighting for liberty and democracy, just like our forefathers before us. It was a wonderful time of my life. I have many brave men to thank for it. Without their courage and strength, we would never have become the great nation that we are today. We are a nation to be reckoned with, and it is our right and duty to take a position of strength among the other nations of the world. a position that will do no injustice to any foreign power, weak or strong, but will show that we have the strength and spirit to repel injustice from abroad. My last act as president was to send the Great White Fleet sailing around the world to show the world that we have the largest navy in the world. And not to be a threatening force, we painted all the ships white. But the world now knows that we are a strength in the world, not only with our democracy, but with our military might as well. And we will use that might to fight for freedom and liberty. And I can speak from experience now. I've been on freedom's battlefield. I've smelled the gunpowder, heard the explosion, seen my comrades fall beside me. There is nothing greater than fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and our democracy, fighting for the American way. It's a great honor to be an American veteran, and it's a great honor to be here today among the rugged pioneers of the West who have shown me the true path to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here's to the Rough Riders, the greatest freedom fighters I've ever known. Long may they live.